Welcome again. I'm Brian Lee Durfee. If you watched my video yesterday, you noticed that I took a road trip down to southern Utah to visit the Mountain Meadows Massacre Memorial site to do some research on a Western novel that I started writing. And the first few chapters of that Western novel take place at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So I've read several, these are a lot of the books of Mormon history. Some of them deal specifically with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and I had read them over periods of different times under the banner of Heaven American Massacre, probably the best ones on the subject. But I wanted to get a first-hand look at the place, so I went down there. I shot a video. You can watch that. I'll link to it. I described the history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And after I visited the monument, my parents live in Sevier County, Utah, not far from there. So I went and visited them, and I told them, yeah, I'd just been out to visit the Mountain Meadows. And my dad made the offhand comment that, oh, yeah, rumor is your great-great-great-great-grandfather, Jabez Durfee, was involved in that massacre. It's alleged. I mean, nobody knows for sure. And I was like, really? I've not heard of this before. And so my dad didn't know a whole lot about it. But anyway, I stayed up all night last night researching my great-great-grandfather, Jabez Durfee. And I found out a lot of stuff that I did not know about my ancestry, especially as it relates to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I'll get into that here in a bit. For those of you that don't know what the Mountain Meadows Massacre is, you can go watch my video that I did yesterday. It's going to be right here next. I'll link to that also. In a nutshell, Mountain Meadows Massacre was this. A wagon train called the Fancher Party was crossing. They're going to California from Arkansas in 1857. They were going through the southern Utah deserts. The Mormons down in Cedar City took exception to this wagon train for a lot of different reasons. Nobody really has pinpointed exactly why they were upset with this particular wagon train and wanted to attack it. But rumor is that some people in that wagon train were being disrespectful as they passed through Cedar City, mentioning a lot about the murder of the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith, and then maybe that they were glad he had been killed, and maybe that they had even maybe participated in his murder. That's kind of the general consensus of why the Mormons in Cedar City were pissed off at this particular wagon train. Well, anyway, long story short, the Mormon Militia in Cedar City attacked the wagon train. There was 140 people in that wagon train, and they killed everybody in the wagon train, men, women, and children, all except for 17 really, really young children, which they kept for themselves and adopted into their own families. So, as I was researching this out after my dad's comment about my great-great-grandfather possibly being in that militia that attacked the Fancher wagon train party, I became like, I've got to figure this out, because that's just who I am. I've read all these books before. Never was his name mentioned in any of these books about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But the internet was there, and so I just Googled his name, and I found a lot of stuff. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But one of the things that struck me as I was introducing myself to the history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the Fancher Party itself. Now, there's a list online of the victims of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, their names and their ages. And one of the things that struck me is of the 140 people in that Fancher Party, 67 of them were teenagers or younger. So almost half of the party was comprised of children, which left another about 70 adults, 30 of which were grown adult men. So I was just blown away by this. I just did not realize, you think of a wagon train, you just think of the adults, right? I mean, they were mostly young people. They were families that had lots of children going across the plains to California from Arkansas to pursue whatever dream it was that they had. And they were ambushed and murdered by these Mormon militiamen. And there were 54 Mormon militiamen that ambushed them and murdered them. And we'll get into that in a second. But I wanted to talk about the victims first, because I was just so, when I started to reread all this stuff and research it online, I was just so saddened that these poor people were murdered by religious zealots, the Mormon militia from Cedar City. It was just terrible. I was just like feeling like really emotional about it, especially finding out how many children there were and how many that these 54 grown adult Mormon militiamen went and slaughtered women and children. I mean, to me, it's just a heinous, murderous, callous, evil, wicked, cowardly act. And as I was reading through all of this stuff about my great-great-grandfather, Jabez Durfee, finding out that he very likely, and I will get into some of the facts here, but he very likely participated in this, was just, heartbreaking in a lot of ways. Because you don't want to find out that your ancestors did and made extremely poor choices and did very bad things. Nobody wants to know that. However, I am a history person. I research things. I appreciate facts. And so that's what I went on a quest for after my journey down to Mountain Meadows and finding out. Literally, I've known about Mountain Meadows Massacre my whole life. I've read a ton of books about Mountain Meadows Massacre throughout my life in preparation for writing an Old West novel that's kind of centered around that. Just finding out yesterday from my father, oh yeah, your great-grandfather, he may have participated in that. I was just like, what? What? I have to know about this. So what I did was I researched it. And this is what I found. This is what I found about my distant relative, Jabez Durfee, spelled Jabez-Durfee. Any of you can Google this. It's all public. It's public knowledge now. It's out there. This is what I found out. Jabez Durfee was 29 years old in 1857, September 11th of 1857, when the Mountain Meadows Massacre took place. So just a young guy. Keep in mind, Jabez's father was Edmund Durfee. Now, Edmund Durfee was murdered back in Missouri or Illinois by anti-Mormon mobs. And I know my parents have went out and visited Edmund Durfee's gravesite and stuff like that. So Jabez was probably eyewitness to his own father's murder by anti-Mormon mobs back east. So he's a young man now living in Cedar City, Utah, probably holds a lot of resentment for anybody that might be coming through Utah bragging about killing Mormons back east, or the prophet Joseph Smith back east. So then, and I bet Jabez Durfee was not the only one that felt that way. A lot of the Mormons were persecuted back east by the anti-Mormons quite heavily. And we won't get into all that, but that's why the Mormons fled to the west, just to get away from the persecution that they were suffering in the east. They fled to the west. A lot of them probably held a lot of resentment for Easterners, especially Easterners that were disrespectful to them. And so I can understand somewhat the inciting incident of why they might take exception to a wagon train coming through their territory now, full of people that are being disrespectful and bragging about murdering Mormons previous. That does not justify what they did at all. Does not justify them murdering 140 people, most of which were women and children. does not justify it, but it does give a context to why the event happened. So Jabez Durfee, 29 years old, and now living in Cedar City, Utah, having probably witnessed his own father's murder by anti-Mormon mobs, wagon train rolls through, right? He's part of the Cedar City, Iron County Militia. He is in the 2nd Battalion. This is what I found out. Multiple online sources confirm this, and I will give the websites names. The 1857massacre.com, Mormon Church of Jesus Christ.org. I mean, this is all, I mean, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints itself, you can find this information. So Jabez Durfee, 29 years old, wagon train comes through. He's part of the Iron County Mormon Militia, 2nd Battalion under a gentleman named Isaac Haight. Isaac Haight. And what we know, what I found out, and what is confirmed fact is the only person found guilty and tried and executed for the crime of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the leader of the battalion, John D. Lee. So years after the massacre happened, John D. Lee was executed as the ringleader of this massacre, and he, in his confessional, in the book that he wrote about the massacre, which was called Mormonism Unveiled, he lists the 54 militiamen that participated in the planning of the massacre and the execution of the massacre, and Jabez Durfee is on that list. Now, once the 54 militiamen went out to harass the wagon train, the Fancher wagon train, they went on September 7th of 1857. They circled the wagon train. They pretended that they were Paiute Indians, and they harassed the wagon train from the September 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. So 4 days they harassed this wagon train, shooting. The wagon train circled, they circled their wagons, the Fancher Party, to protect themselves. The Mormon militia pretending to be Paiute Indians hid up in the hills, shot their guns down into the wagon train, killing 10 of the men, 10 of the Fancher Party adult men. So now we've got, now we went from 30 adult men in the party of 140 to only like 20 adult men, to a party of 130. And at one point, the Mormon militia realized that, hey, they figured out we're not actually Indians. We need to go do something. So they sent a emissary down into the Fancher Party wagon circle and said, hey, let's strike a truce. These Indians, they're still playing up the Indian card. These Paiute Indians are going to ambush you. We're the Mormon militia. We will, if you give up your weapons, it'll appease the Indians, and we will escort you through Indian country and you'll be safe. And it took several hours for them to convince the Fancher Party to give up their weapons, right? And they didn't want to do it. And my previous video, when I was out at Mountain Meadows Massacre, I made sort of a flippant comment about never give up your weapons, right? If you're at the gate and they ask you to give up your sword at the gate, don't give it up. At this point, we have to recognize the Fancher Party is of 140 people. There's 54 Mormon militiamen, all heavily armed. The Fancher Party, though it's 140 people, 10 of the men have already been killed. There's only 20 adult men left. The rest are women and children. And so they give up their weapons. As soon as they give up their weapons, the Mormon militia turns on them and murders all of them, except for the 17 youngest, which range from the age of just babies, just months-old babies, to about 5 or 6 years old. And those kids they kept and they took back to Cedar City and adopted into their own families. Now, here's the thing. We don't know of the 54 militiamen that went out with John D. Lee and Isaac Haight with the Mormon Cedar City, Iron County battalions. We don't know what the individual 54 guys did. We do know that one of them refused to kill the women and children. And what they did to the guy that refused, they tied him to a wagon wheel as punishment. For the whole day, they just tied him to a wagon wheel. So the one guy that refused to participate in the slaughter, they tied him to a wagon wheel. From all intents and purposes, everybody else in that militia participated in killing the Fancher Party. Eyewitness accounts from some of the surviving kids was, and keep in mind these were little kids, that not every person, not everyone in the Mormon militia, some of them didn't shoot, but there was a lot that did. So when you say who actually participated, no one will ever know. Did Jabez Durfee pull the trigger? No one will ever know. We weren't there. We didn't see it. However, the facts are he was there at the scene. According to John D. Lee's confessional, because he named the names of all 54 people that went with him. And my great-great-grandfather. Now, so where does this leave me? How do I feel about this? Oh, I think I explained how I felt about it. It was cold-hearted, brutal, vicious, wicked murder out of religious fervor for no reason, and it was cowardly. It's just what it is. Like I said, I'm not going to let my personal connection to this event sway how I feel about it. I always felt like this was a dark, dark moment in Mormon history, in the history of the West. And I think it was an act of terrorism. I think it was an act of religious terrorism on people. But the Old West, the Old West was a hard place to live. And it was brutal. It was lawless. People held nobody else to account. There's a lot of American history that's ugly. And this is part of it. This is just part of it. I thought I would make this follow-up video, and I hope you've watched it and, learned a little bit more about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This will be the last I talk of it. This is kind of my review of all these books under the banner of heaven, American Massacre, Gathering of Saints, Mormon Murders. There's a whole bunch of them. You can read so much about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, both in book form and online. And that's the video. So if you ever get a chance, folks, to go out and to southern Utah and visit the memorial, do so. Or you can watch my previous video. I take it out there too.